Sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Iti piso bhagavata sama sambuddho vichara sama sujato lokahindu anuttaro purisam asarati sapadeva manussanam buddho bhavani. Svannato bhagavata namo samhito avarato edivasito opanaiko acharam veditao vinduhi. Supatisanno bhagavato savasamso Ujupatitamo bhagavato savasamso Nyayapatitamo bhagavato savasamso Samishtirapitamo bhagavato savasamso Yadiyam Chattari Purisayukani Atta Purisapurala Esa Bhagavato Savakasamho Ameyo Ameyo Dakineyo Amcharikareyo Anukaram Punyakedam Lodasati.
Okay, we have sound, we have liftoff. Excellent. Great. So, how's it going, everyone? Going okay? Okay, good, excellent. Feels a little bit colder today. Is it a bit colder today? Feels a bit, yeah. -5. -5. It feels quite a lot colder today. Thought I might have been exaggerating. Okay. All right, so today we're going to be reading a sutta from the Pali Canon, and see how long this takes. Usually maybe 2 or 3 nights it takes to explain the sutta. I've taught this particular sutta a couple of times on this tour, and it's taken 2 or 3 nights, but those were also in translation. So today we don't have translation, so it might be a bit quicker. We'll see how we go. All right. Now I have my expert advisor over here who's going to let me know whenever I say anything that requires prior knowledge, so I can make sure that everything is explained as we go, all right? Thank you. Inexpert advisor, perhaps. An advisor in expertise. It's actually like really important. I find this a lot, like even when I'm making my translations, you know, people sort of want to help and I say, oh, you could proofread my translations or something. And then they say, oh, but I don't know anything. I'm saying, yeah, that's why. Yeah, because people who know things and to not notice what they know. Anyway, moving on. So this is the honey cake discourse in Pali, is the Madhu Pindika Sutta. Yes. We have some what missing? You need some more sutta, you need some more of these. Is that right? Do we have more, Adi? Okay, so are we good now? Okay, excellent. So this is the honey cake discourse in Pali called the Madhu Pindika Sutta, the word sutta meaning discourse. And it is the 18th discourse in the Majjhima Nikaya. And I'll just explain what the Majjhima Nikaya, the middle discourses, is. Okay, so let me give just a brief background as to what Buddhist scriptures are. Okay, and I'm going to do this, let me do this as a commentary. Okay, so the first words in the sutta here, it says, so have I heard. Okay. I did a 10-day retreat on the story of the Buddha's last days. It's one of the longest suttas, and I did a whole. I'm very proud of myself. I did like a whole evening's Dhamma talk on so have I heard. One of the highlights of my life so far. Okay, so the heard here refers to the oral tradition. And in the Buddha's day, scriptures were passed down by memorizing and reciting them and passing them down through the oral tradition rather than the written tradition. So that's why it says, so I have heard. So a bit of background on this. The Buddha lived about roughly 2,500 years ago in northern India. And the region that he mostly traveled in is the Ganges plain, as far south as what they call the Deccan, as far north as the Himalayan foothills. And where we are now is in the northern reaches of that area, in the Republic of the Sakyan Republic, which today is, it's in India if you ask the Indians, and it's in Nepal if you ask the Nepalese. So it kind of depends, but the Sakyan Republic probably was in both of those areas. So sort of not far from the Himalayan foothills, sort of the northern reach of the cultural region where the Buddha lived and taught. So the Buddha went forth and started practicing when he was 29 years old. 29 years old was when he began practicing. I wonder how old were we when we started practicing? Who here was 29 or younger when they started practicing? I was like 26, 29, 29. Quite a few. Okay. That's good. I went to a monastery and ordained when I was 26, and one of the older French monks said, "How old are you?" I said 26. He said, "That is too old." Your mind is already fossilized by that point. I wanted to prove him wrong. Anyway, so 29, he went forth and then he practiced for 6 years. When he went forth, of course, he left behind his family. And this is very tragic. He left behind his wife and a newborn son. And he left behind all of the people in his family. And a lot of people were really distraught. And so this is a very poignant and, to my mind, an irreducibly tragic moment in the Buddha's career. Like, I don't think we should try to explain it away too much. In this, when the Buddha's life story is retold, which it is in endless variations in the Buddhist traditions, the tellers of the story always find some way to negotiate that point of the pain of the Buddha's separation from his wife and his son, his wife Yashoda and son Rahula. And personally, I think we shouldn't try to explain that away or justify it, but rather we should apprehend it. To me, this is an existential moment. And the moment of the Buddha's renunciation and going forth is the same that you have all gone through in coming here. You have all left things behind, left people behind, left all of those things you could have done behind, and you've come here. For some of you, that might have been quite difficult and quite painful. Many others, maybe not. But still, there's something left behind. And so that moment of renunciation where there's a juxtaposition of different levels of value in your life, this is essential in understanding the Buddha's path. And a number of people have spoken to me about this in their interviews in one way or another. When they come to Buddhism, they realize that there's some meaning, some value in Buddhism. And all of the things that they've seen before in their lives, do they have any value? Does having a career have a value? Does going out for dinner with your friends have a value? And we can sort of enter into a state where we can question the meaning of all of those things that we've had. For most people, that period of questioning lasts a long time. Probably lasts your whole life. Yeah? May well last your whole life. And we shouldn't see that questioning or that tension as being a problem as such. In fact, what that does is that gives you an added dimension on life. Because we might be thinking, is there any meaning to going out to dinner with your friends and just socializing and chatting? Or would you rather live a life where you never even asked that question because you didn't know that there might be another level of meaning? Yeah? So we're giving like a third dimension to your life. Unfortunately, we don't tell you about that until it's too late. Okay? So you can't go backwards. Sorry about that. And you can't undo it. You can forget it for a while, right? But you will go through your life and you will experience this in different ways. And for myself, I can look back on my life as a monk and the different ways that I've experienced these kinds of tensions. Like when I was younger, when I was a young monk or these kinds of things, if I saw people go families or things like this, and then I'd probably be like, there's so much attachment. Yeah. Caught up in attachment and suffering and everything. But now I don't think like that at all. Like if I see families together, I think, there's so much love. I think it's really beautiful, actually. And I think it's amazing that people can live lives where they care for each other. And I think that's such a beautiful thing. So I don't think that there's not like one resolution to this or to this tension. It's something that is our journey for the rest of our lives. So the Buddha left home, practiced for 6 years, right? Okay, I just want you to stop and remember, we've been on this retreat for 3 days. And we've got nice heating, we've got nice food, nice friends around, right? The Buddha was alone in the middle of the jungle. Tigers, bears, mosquitoes, awe-inspiring forest groves full of ghosts. Who knows what? Yeah. And to sit alone in the middle, like in those days, India, I mean, it's mostly jungle and occasionally a town or something like that. Occasionally a lonely road with some travelers. And so he went and practiced in those jungles for 6 years. Not always alone. Sometimes he stayed in ashrams with different teachers, or he had different companions with him when he was practicing. But it wasn't easy. At the end of that period, then he realized that the pain that he was going through in those practices was not achieving anything. And so he discovered the middle way and realized that the happiness of the mind is what would lead to liberation. So he was now 35, and from then on he started teaching and setting up his sangha, or his community. And so from the beginning, the Buddha had a plan to establish what we call the fourfold community. There's bhikkhus, bhikkhunis, monks and nuns, and laymen and laywomen. And so that 4-quadrant community is meant to be all-encompassing. Like those in Buddhism, the 4 quadrants are meant to be 4 directions, right? Yeah. And it's meant to be all-inclusive. So I just want to make a special point of that actually there are quite a number of people sometimes who maybe fall between the cracks on that, right? Maybe don't consider themselves perhaps bhikkhus or bhikkhunis. For example, there might be samaneris or sayales or mechi, and various people who have renounced to some degree, but maybe not fully ordained. So where are they? Or people maybe who are non-binary, or people who don't fit within all of these categories neatly. You think, well, do I fit into one of those things? It's not, the purpose of that is not to say that there are 4 and only 4 groups and anybody else is out. Okay? The 4 groups are like the 4 directions. They're meant to indicate the directions, but actually meant to be universal. Okay? So the Buddhist community is meant to be a universal one that includes everyone. And so there is only one entry requirement for Buddhist practice, one, which you have to have, very strict, vedyamanasa, for one who feels. So you have to be able to feel. If you can feel, then that's okay. That's it. So don't be thinking, oh, I'm not a good Buddhist because I don't do all the right things, I don't do this, I don't do that, and so on and so forth. It doesn't matter. The Buddha taught because he wanted you to let go of suffering and move towards freedom. That's it. That's what Buddhism is about. Vedyamanasa, for one who feels. That's who the Buddha taught. Amen. So the Buddha traveled across India from that time, teaching everyone. Like you guys, many of you have been to India. Who's been to India? Right? Okay. So I think one thing we can all agree on is India is weird, right? It's full of all kinds of strange things and strange people, and it resists any kind of reduction and simplicity, and always tends towards this abundance of, certainly in spirituality, an abundance of spirituality and philosophy of all kinds. And that was the case in the Buddha's time as well. And there were so many different little sects and different groups and different teachers teaching stuff that was often wild, okay? I mean, some of the stuff they were teaching was wild. Like one of the teachers would say, okay, there's no such thing as good and evil, all right? You can go down the north shore of the Ganges and slaughter everybody you meet until there's nothing but a mass of death, that whole Ganges, and you would never do anything bad by doing it. And you can go down the south bank of the Ganges and make offerings and be kind and be generous, and you're not making any merit by doing that. No such thing as good and evil. I mean, that's a wild teaching, right? It would be hard, it would be difficult to have that teaching today and then to apply for like tax exemption status as a religious organization, right? And there, they were like naked ascetics, right? Wandering around, not wearing any clothes, not bathing, all of this kind of stuff, as well as people doing different kinds of rituals, different vows. Some people would do like, you had like the ox duty ascetic and the dog duty ascetic. So you like basically, I'm going to live like an ox. I'm going to live like a dog, and you just live like a dog. You like eat out of a bowl and curl up and lie down. And that's it. That's your practice. I'm going to keep doing that for like so many years. So like people were wild. Like we think today of maybe, we have like diverse spirituality and many different things. We got nothing, okay, on India and especially on ancient India. They had so many different options. So the Buddha went around and tried and practiced all of these things. And yes, he learned from many of them and many of the different religions and spiritualities he learned from. He learned from the Jains about harmlessness, about practicing mindfulness, about non-violence. Learned from the Brahmanical teachers about consciousness and about the importance of purifying the mind and letting go of violence. So many important things that he learned. But at a certain time that he had to let go, he had to find his own truth. So then he went and he taught that truth. And he defined that, as we discussed the other day, as the middle way. Now, at a certain point came one of the Buddha's biggest challenges. He had to go home. Awkward, put it mildly, okay? So he's like walked out, but the Buddha, or his given name Siddhartha, was apparently, he was a member of one of the leading families in the Sakya Republic. So his republic is the place that he lived. The nation was called Sakya, and the Sakya clan was the ruling clan of that republic, and they were a quasi-democratic republic. By quasi-democratic, what I mean is that they didn't have an inherited king, but the ruler would be elected periodically by the leading families. So it wasn't like they didn't have like full democracy, but like their leading families, mostly, which would be like the landowning families, would then elect a leader for a period of time. And so he was from one of those leading families. So when he left, obviously, there's a lot of gossip. Everybody's like, did you hear about that Sakya and Siddhartha? And he went on. And like, what's going on? What's going on? And a lot of people very annoyed. I mean, he left his family behind. And so it's got to be somewhat awkward when you return. And this particular sutta records one such awkward family encounter. Okay. How are we going so far? Anything needing explanation? We're good? Excellent. Oh, no, I haven't even finished. Go on. How can I even do that? Okay, so fine. So the Buddha taught for 45 years. Then when he when he passed away, the Sangha, which is the community of disciples, got together and formed a canon of teachings in order to preserve his teachings for future generations. Now, at that time, nobody knew whether Buddhism would survive. This is really important for understanding early Buddhism and the early Buddhist community. To us, it seems obvious that Buddhism survived, that what they did worked. But at the time, nobody really knew that. And in fact, the odds are obviously stacked against you. There are new religious movements all over the place all the time, and almost all of them disappear very quickly. So somehow they did something that managed to pull together the Buddhist community and to keep it going. It's obviously a profound question for understanding the nature of the Buddhist community. But one of the key things that they did was to establish a scriptural canon. So they got together in a cave called the Satapani Cave, in a city just outside of a city called Rajagaha, modern Rajgir, in Bihar state, south of the Ganges. And there they spent 3 months reciting scriptures. And the history of that obviously is long and complicated, but the basic idea is that the Buddhist canon consists of 3 parts. We call it Tripitaka. One is the suttas, which we have one example of here. Then the Vinaya, which is the monastic code for the monks and nuns, and the Abhidhamma, which is the scholastic treatise, which gives like systematic treatments of the main teachings of the Buddha. So suttas, Vinaya, and the Abhidhamma. And these were recited in the language of Pali. And that scripture has been preserved and passed down in the Theravadan school. And this is a translation of that, which we have here today. Other schools of Buddhism formed, and they had very similar canons, which were then at later dates translated or sometimes shifted from Pali to Sanskrit and then later into Chinese and Tibetan. But the main canon we rely on for understanding early Buddhism is the Pali canon, from which this was translated. Now the suttas, so remember we have the Tripitaka, 3 parts. Suttas is one of those parts. Suttas has 5 parts, and 4 plus 1. The 4 are the long discourses, middle discourses, connected discourses, and numerical discourses. And then you have 1 which is the miscellaneous discourses. And there's a whole long list, a whole bunch of stuff which is in there. So the one that we're looking at today is in the Majjhima Nikaya. So it's this little one here, the long discourses, middle discourses. So these middle discourses, this one here, middle discourses, they have about, they have 152 discourses there. So this is one of the 152 discourses in the middle discourses. If you print them as a book, you either get 1 very thick book or 3 moderately sized books. And all of these, I should mention, are on a wonderful website called Sutta Central. Which is so lovely, and you should all go and see it. And not only can you read this on Sutta Central, you can read it in Pali, and you can also read it in translations. Many people here speak French. We have French translations. Some people speak German. We have German translations. We have, I think, Polish translations. I think so. And many others. So yeah. We'll be looking at the text in English, which is my translation. Obviously, it's good. I don't know what to say about that. But of course, sometimes it's nicer to be reading in your own language, if it's language you're more familiar with. Anyway. Okay, so that's where this comes, and this is number 18 in the middle length discourses. All right. So that's my brief, mercifully brief commentary on So I Have Heard. Feel yourself lucky that that's all you get. Are there any questions on that before we go on? We good? We think we're good. Excellent. Excellent. Anyone else? Yeah.
So it's the same with like plus months it has been said.
Sorry?
So when they start off sometimes with a sutta saying plus months it has been said.
Thus, monks, it has been said.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So is that the same as So I Have Heard?
That is correct. Yeah. Usually you wouldn't put monks in there. It's not actually in the Pali.
Right.
Yeah, that's what I heard is kind of a classic formulation. Yeah. Yes, that's correct. And it's traditionally it's at the beginning of every discourse, although often it's abbreviated away. Anything? No, we're good. All right. At one time. Okay, now we're going to have another commentary on this one. We don't know what time this was. Unfortunately, as you can see, it says at one time the Buddha was staying in the land of the Sakyans near Kapilavatthu in the Banyan Tree Monastery. So we know where the land of the Sakyans was. Like I said, it's on the northern India, straddling the border between modern-day India and Nepal. Kapilavatthu, we know where it is. There's excavations for the site of Kapilavatthu. You can actually go to there and see this is where Kapilavatthu was. That was like the capital city. The Banyan Tree Monastery, I'm not sure if the Banyan Tree Monastery has been identified, but we certainly know roughly where that is, but we don't really know when it is. Unfortunately, the suttas don't record the dates that these teachings were given, which would have been nice. But I suspect that, well, if we look in a bit later, if we can date this, on the one hand, it's like a family drama with one of the other Sakyans. So that might suggest that it's a bit early in the dispensation when those dramas were still being felt, perhaps. On the other hand, we see some of the characters later on appearing, Mahakachana and Ananda, who ordained, after some years, after the Buddha had been teaching for some years. So it's certainly not immediately after the Buddha got enlightened, right? So remember, there's a 45-year period when this could have been taught. So it's not immediately after the Buddha was enlightened, maybe 10 years later or something like that. A bit hard to say. So most of the time with suttas, we don't really have very precise information as to the time. All right. Then the Buddha robed up in the morning and, taking his bowl and robe, entered Kapilavatthu for alms. He wandered for alms in Kapilavatthu. After the meal, on his return from alms round, he went to the great wood for the day's meditation, plunged deep into it, and sat at the root of a young wood apple tree to meditate. Okay, so this is giving us some nice little details about the Buddha's life. I really love these little bits in suttas, okay, because it's telling you like who was the Buddha and what did he do, right? And for me, like when I read a lot of like later sutras and Mahayana sutras and things like that, and a lot of it is like, the Buddha manifested 10,000 rays in different colors and then traveled through different realms and did all of these things and all of these kinds of miracles and so on. I mean, to me, this is like, that's like that's like all the CGI which is added to it, that's like all of the effects which is there to make it look pretty and stuff. But to me, I like my Buddha simple. It's very relatable. So let me just give a couple of comments from a monastic point of view about what these things mean. So first of all, the idiom robed up in the morning. What does this mean? Well, the sutta says basically that he puts on his robe. But one of the things to understand is, okay, so monastic robes, I'll explain to you how monastic robes work, okay? I actually have my 3 robes here, so that's good. So basically, monks have 3 robes, and the bhikkhunis have an extra 2. Bloody luxury! You don't get an extra 2 rules. Nobody talks about all the things with it.
It's hot in tropical countries.
Always something to complain about. Fine, okay. Hot in tropical countries. Okay, so we have the underrobe, which has got the antaravasika. So it's basically like a sarong. And this is normally in the Buddha's day, then that's all you would wear inside the monastery. Right? So you just have like that one robe. Then when you went outside of the monastery, you put on this upper robe. I call it Uttarasanga, which is this one. And so this covers the upper body. And so this was like the polite robe that you'd wear out, or if you needed to so usually we'll wear this robe if we're doing anything like, if we're doing a Dhamma talk or a puja, or if we're doing anything formal, we'll put this upper robe on. And then we have this robe, which is called Sanghati. This is a double layered robe, and this goes on the outside like a cloak. So this is like our coat or our cloak, and so this is sewn. If you look at it closely, it's sewn with like two layers of cloth that are sort of sewn together. So it's a little bit warm, and I mean it's all relative. Look, it's not too bad because if you have the two layers, then you double it over, then you've got 4 layers. It's not too bad. Quite helpful. It's -5 outside. And so we use this sometimes. The robes are like very useful. We can use them as blankets. You can use them as tents. You can use them as sheets. You can use them to keep the rain off, keep the snow off, and parasailing. I haven't tried that, but potentially that's another possible application. So anyway, so when it says the Buddha robed up in the morning, mostly what it means is that he would have been wearing his lower robe, and then he would have put on his underrobe and maybe his sangati as well to leave the monastery. So that's robed up in the morning. In the morning, of course, because that's when we eat. Yeah.
Why one shoulder? No.
Okay, why one shoulder? Yeah. So the convention is that when having one shoulder open is considered to be a sign of respect, and it's usually understood. Like, I'm not actually sure where the historical origins of that are, but it's usually understood as being like a gesture of non-violence in the sense that you're showing that you're not hiding any weapons. So you open this because that's your sword arm. Right? So you expose that one shoulder, and so then you're saying that you're not hiding anything or anything like that. So usually if we circumambulate the Buddha, then you do that with your right shoulder open towards the Buddha as well. Again, it's a gesture of harmlessness. But then when we're going out into the village, then we put it over both shoulders. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, what the colors stand for? The colors.
Oh, the colours. What are the colours for? Well, story goes, I mean, obviously these are just conventional colours for monastics, right? So if you see even today, like sadhus and monastics in India usually wear something in this kind of red, yellow, orange, brown spectrum. The story goes that when the Buddha left home, he swapped his princely robes with a hunter who would have obviously been wearing like dull-coloured robes to blend in, like dull-coloured clothes to blend in with the bush. But it's interesting that these colours are also the colours worn by not just hunters, but by executioners and condemned criminals, right? So that's a somewhat interesting set of associations. Yeah. And so those images of like death or outsidership, like you're adopting something which is setting you outside of society. And practically speaking, the robes would have been dyed with plant dyes. And until recently, they were all dyed with plant dyes. In fact, my first robes when I was in Thailand were dyed with dye made from the jackfruit tree. So what they would do is when a jackfruit tree falls over, then you get the trunk. People will cut the trunk up and they bring it to the monastery, and then you get a big machete and you go chop, 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 and you cut off all the chips off the jackfruit, and then you get a big wok like this. And then you put the chips in the wok and you boil it down, and you keep on boiling it down until you get like a thick, almost like a crude oil consistency. So the dye is like the consistency almost as thick as crude oil. Of course, if you're me, you do that on the morning after the all-night meditation, and then you fall asleep, and then you wake up, and there's a hole in the bottom of the wok where the fire has burnt through it, and all of your dye is destroyed, and the wok is destroyed. But don't do that. Yeah, so that monastery that I was at originally, then we kept all of those practices, sewing the robes by ourselves and making the dye and so on. Of course, these days most of the robes are chemical dyes. So the variations in colours also arise because of what plants you happen to have locally. So in Sri Lanka, this colour is the Genkanu colour, the jackfruit colour, and say the Sri Lankan robe colour comes from mahogany. So they usually use mahogany wood for dyeing. So that's why you end up with those different colours. Okay. Yeah.
Does the apple tree have any symbolic meaning?
Good question. I don't know. Not that I know of. But thanks for asking, because now I'm going to have to do like a whole research project. Yeah.
Do you have the English name or the Latin name of that young apple tree?
The
Wood
wood
apple
apple
tree?
tree. Just their normal English name is wood apple tree.
Okay.
Yeah. Can't remember the Pali name. Okay. Are we good? All right. What else? All right. Okay. So taking his bowl and robe, entered Kapilavatthu for alms. So one of the things you can see from that is that the monastery was not too far away from the city. And so normally a monastery should be situated neither too far nor too close. And 20 minutes, half an hour is a good kind of distance. Sometimes the monastery will be further away, but once you start to get more than like say an hour away, then it's difficult to go for alms. If it's too close, of course, you get caught up in all the business inside the city. And he wandered for alms in Kapilavatthu. So the normal practice in Buddhism when we go for alms is that we go from house to house or from place to place. It's also possible to go for alms round by arrangement. Right? So somebody might say, oh, please come and I'd like to offer you some alms. So you can go to their house by arrangement. Now, of course, the Buddha, as a very famous teacher and as the son of a very prominent family, he could have gone to his own home for alms very easily. Right? And there would have been plenty of places where he could go and get invited for alms. But he's not, and he would do that from time to time. But his normal practice most of the time was just to wander at random through the city. And so anybody who had the opportunity to offer alms could do so. So this practice of alms round is very, very beautiful practice and one that is very dear to the heart of Buddhist monastics. When I'm in Sydney, I'm very lucky that I get the opportunity to go for alms round every day. And I live in what's called Little India. And when I go for alms round, I will robe up in the morning. I will not plunge into a great wood or anything like that, but I will step out onto the street and go through a little path where all of the Indian grandmas and granddads are sitting and they're often doing their puja. They put up a little shrine and they'll do a puja and they'll sing some bhajan and so on. It's really lovely. And so there's a whole kind of community feel there. And then one of the houses I go by is where this Jain lady called Deepika who lives, and she and her kids are sometimes out in the backyard looking after their bunny rabbits. And so there's like a whole thing, which I really love. And then when I go for alms, sometimes people from the Buddhist community will come, or not sometimes, but every day people from the Buddhist community are there. And they come from like the Vietnamese community, Malaysian, Sri Lankan, Western people, all different backgrounds of Pindabata, but also many of the local restaurants and shops will also offer alms. One day when we went for alms there, one of another monk who's a friend of mine, and his friend, but his friend was not a Buddhist, and he came with us on alms round. And when we went around for alms, we would go to the Gujarati place and they'd give us some alms, yeah.
bowl.
Walking with the bowl, and people give you food. Yeah, not money. We don't take money, just food. And then we go to the Gujarati place, and they gave us something. We go to the Sikh place, and they would give us something. We go to the Nepalese place, they give us something. We go to the Muslim grocers, and then they come out, they give us a whole lot of fruit. And then we go to all of these different places. And this friend was like really puzzled. And he said, but aren't they the competition? And we're like, well, we don't really think of it like that. It's more just like being kind. And so to me, this is really lovely about being in that environment. And you see, and actually that is Indian culture, that the support for the spiritual life is something which is universally shared and universally held, and everybody loves to do that and support that. And so it's not that like everybody in India today or in the past day was Buddhist, but they just love to be able to support people who are meditating and who are doing spiritual practice. So the Buddha, after the meal, returned from alms round, he went to the great wood for the day's meditation. All right, so the great wood, all right. The great wood, according to the Pali commentaries, and let me just give a bit of an explanation here about what the Pali commentaries are. So I said that Buddha lived about 2,500 years ago, and these canons, that is the suttas, were formed around that time. I mean, a bit of editing, a bit of messing around and so on, but basically 2,500 years ago. Then they were passed down in the Buddhist community, and when things get passed down in the community, then people will always have something to say about it, like I am now, right? And everybody's got an opinion to offer about something, and they get eventually codified and formed into their own literature, which we call the commentaries. So in Sri Lanka, so while these suttas are shared among all Buddhist traditions, these are foundational to all Buddhist traditions. The commentaries, however, were formed in Sri Lanka by the Theravada tradition about 1,000 years after the Buddha, drawing on a long history of discussion and explanation and clarification of the suttas. And so they were compiled and edited mostly by a monk called Buddhaghosa in a monastery called the Mahavihara in Anuradhapura in Sri Lanka in about 400 and something AD. So a bit less than 1,000 years, about 800 years after the Buddha. So that commentarial literature is one of our primary go-to sources for giving explanations about things that are not always found in the suttas themselves. All the Buddhist traditions have their own commentaries and their own treatises and so on, which are all different, but in the Pali, they have the commentarial tradition of Buddhaghosa. Okay, so in that commentarial tradition, it says that the great wood, the Mahavana, stretched from the Himalayan mountains in the north all the way to the ocean in the south. So that's about 2,000 kilometers, something like that. Yeah? And so vast wood, which is still the remnant of the woods that would have covered the whole of the subcontinent of India. Yeah? And amazing to think that area, go to that area today, and it is not covered in great woods, unfortunately. But in those days it still was. In the ancient Indian treaties, they go into some great detail about how we are supposed to look after nature. And they say that every village or every town should have 3 woods, okay? 3 forests for every town. One should be the great forest, which is the wilderness. Second one is the tapovana, which is for the meditation. And the third one is the sirivana, which is used for firewood and building and so on. So that's where you can chop down the trees. So 3 forests for every village. Amazing, right? Mm-hmm. Incredible how much foresight that they had all those thousands of years ago. I often encounter these things. Did you realize that like forestry and conservation is not a new thing? You know, I first realized this when I was reading Dostoevsky, and he was talking about how in Russia in the 19th century, everyone was concerned about how all the forests were being chopped down. And then I read, even then it was much older than that, even in, say, the Roman times, in around, I think, 80 AD or something, the Roman governor or the Roman emperor put out an order limiting the felling of the cedar woods in Lebanon. So they had been overlogged. And so they had to have forest management practices, even in the Roman Empire. And this is something that humanity has always considered to be an essential part of who we are and how we relate to the world around us. In Buddhism, there's many things that relate to this, but particularly we find a lot in the Jataka stories, which is a collection of folk tales and legends and stories about, ostensibly about the Buddha's past lives. And many of those Jataka stories deal with the relationship between humanity and nature. For example, in one of those stories, there is a conflict that arises when the men were hunting deer, and it was all kind of back and forth about a deer and all of these kinds of things. Anyway, long story short, at the end of it, they made a covenant, and the king made a rule that they weren't allowed to hunt the deer anymore. Right? However, the deer would then come and eat all the crops, so everyone was complaining. So then they had to make a deal with the king of the deer so that the deer wouldn't eat the crops. And they put up a sign on the crops saying, "Deer, please don't eat these crops." And then the people weren't allowed to hunt the deer and the deer weren't allowed to eat the crops. Not sure how effective that was. Perhaps the literacy rates among deer were higher in those days. Who might have done it, right? But what's really interesting is how important and how critical that was for them to think in terms of we have to reach an understanding and a balance with nature and with the creatures around us. So anyway, so that's the great wood. Yeah.
Is it common for a Buddha to go around by himself? Because he's spreading
Right.
wood by the tree monastery.
Right.
What about organics? Why don't we go in?
Right. Good question. Right. So the question is, why does the Buddha normally go for alms around by himself, and why would the other mendicants go with him? Normally, it would seem that in those days that it was normal to go by yourself. Sometimes you would take an attendant, especially a novice, with you. It's called a pachasamana. So you take an attendant novice with you on alms rounds. So it did happen, but most of the time it seems that they wandered independently for alms. And yes, it does seem that mostly the Buddha went by himself. But I agree, if I was living in that monastery, I'd be sitting in my kuti with one eye out the window, waiting to see the Buddha going off on alms. And then when I see him step out of his kuti, I'd be like, "Oh, excuse me, Bhante, would you mind if I tagged along?" And then I'd tag along behind him and I'd say, "But what about, like, what does Sankara's independent origination really mean?" Which is probably why he went by himself. But again, it's interesting, isn't it, right? It's a very kind of simple lifestyle. Like they didn't even have there wasn't like a set time for Bindabat. They would go whenever they wanted to. It wasn't a set time. They didn't have their meals all together. Again, they would sometimes, like sometimes you'd be invited for a meal or something, but mostly you would go, when you went, you would go as long as you went, you'd come back, you'd eat the meal. Yeah.
In regards to the question about the young apple tree.
Yes.
Luke from a Dharma Foundation group actually shared a talk given by an Indian scholar.
Okay.
He specialized in researching old trees.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this tree is included, but
Awesome.
I'm interested in trees.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you give me the link or the name?
Yeah.
I would love that. I spent quite a bit of time actually researching a lot of these things. Yeah, like on the one hand, who cares? It's just a tree, right? But on the other hand, to me, like establishing all of these details, it's like it gives it's vivid and it's real, you know. It's like it's this particular kind of tree which flowers in this particular season, and you know. And so to me, I really like to try to look into all of these details. So if you've got a name or something for that, I would love to see it. Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay, good. young wood apple tree to meditate. All right, so plunge deep into the great forest. He's sitting, meditating at the bottom of the tree. Fine. Next, Dandapani, the Sakyan, while going for a walk, plunged deep into the great wood. He approached the Buddha, exchanged greetings with him. When the greetings and polite conversation were over, he stood to one side, leaning on his staff, and said to the Buddha, "What is the ascetic's doctrine? What does he assert?" Right. So, few details here. Sakyans, we've already heard of, that the Buddha's clan. So probably someone related to the Buddha. Dandapani, who is Dandapani? Well, this is the only appearance that Dandapani makes anywhere in the suttas or anywhere in the Buddhist scriptures, right? That's it. All we know about him is what we learn in this particular passage. Okay? Now then we supplemented by commentaries and these kinds of things. But the commentaries tell us different stories, which may or may not be contradictory. The word Dandapani means stick in hand. So it was a nickname because of his habit of walking around with a staff. All right. But it also has a kind of symbolic meaning as well, because a staff is also a weapon, right? Like Gandalf entering the hall of Theoden King, right? You wouldn't take the staff away from an old man, would you? So it can be a weapon. In fact, it's one of the rules of our Vinaya, our monastic discipline, that we should not give a Dhamma talk to somebody who has a stick in their hand, because it's considered to be a kind of weapon. So perhaps the Buddha's bending the rules here, or maybe he made this rule later on. Who knows? We don't exactly know. But anyway, nobody was. It's only like a training rule, it's not like a major kind of rule or something like that. So, but the basic idea is that we shouldn't be giving teachings to people with weapons. So Dandapani, also kind of a synonym of wrath, right? So Dandapani is like somebody who's quick to wrath. So he's going for a walk and plunged deep into the great wood. Approach the Buddha and exchange greetings with him. Okay, so I want you to put yourself in Dandapani's shoes. All right, here you are going for a walk in the forest. What do you see? The Buddha sitting meditation under a tree. What do you do? What do you do? Like, if it were me, I would be like, oh my God. What are you? And I'd be like, sound now. I go, what? Try to walk away without crunching any leaves so that I didn't disturb the Buddha meditating. Okay? What I would not do is walk up and say, "G'day, Buddha, how's it going?" But apparently, Dandapani, that's what he did. So already kind of, it's a bit odd, isn't it? I mean, normally, if you not to speak of the Buddha, if you're seeing anyone who's meditating, normally you don't just walk up to them and start talking to them, you just let them meditate. So that's the first sign that something is up with Dandapani, right? Next one, then he says, well, I guess the first sign is the fact that he's got his staff in his hand, right? Stood to one side, leaning on his staff, not necessarily a sign of great respect. Said to the Buddha, "What is the ascetic's doctrine? What does he assert?" A bit blunt, right? A bit blunt. But fair enough. Nothing wrong with being direct. And the Buddha answered him, "Sir, my doctrine is such that one does not conflict with anyone in this world with its gods, maras, and divinities, its population with its ascetics and Brahmins, its gods and humans. And it is such that perceptions do not underlie the Brahman who lives detached from sensual pleasures without doubting, stripped of worry, and rid of craving for rebirth in this or that state. That is my doctrine, and that is what I assert. When he had spoken, Dandapani shook his head, waggled his tongue, raised his eyebrows until his brow puckered in 3 furrows, and he departed leaning on his staff. Safe to say, not the result the Buddha was looking for. So again, a very, very vivid, direct and personal description of Dandapani's reaction. Now, that's about it for Dandapani. Like, that's all we know. Okay? He wandered into the forest, he leans on a staff, talks to the Buddha when he's meditating, and then he does that. Whatever that is, and then walks off and departs from literature and history forever, supposedly. So what more can we say about it? And what can we infer from the Buddha's answer? So let's briefly look at what the Buddha says here. So here says, what does he say? What does he assert? So the Buddha begins by saying, my doctrine is such that one does not conflict with anyone in this world. It's very specific. Right? He could have answered that in any number of ways. In fact, normally, if somebody says, like, what is the Buddha's doctrine? You would say, oh, it's the Four Noble Truths, or it's the, you know, it's a middle way, or something like that. But this is a very specific way of answering. Now, notice a few details about this. First of all, he addresses Dandapani. I've translated it here as Sir, and I can't recall exactly what the term of address is. I'll have to check the Pali. But in any case, it's a respectful term of address, right? So the Buddha is addressing Dandapani with a respectful term of address. Notice also that the Buddha directly answers the question, right? Dandapani says, what is your doctrine? The Buddha says, my doctrine is such. So the Buddha had a number of different ways of answering questions. Sometimes you answer a question with a counter question. Sometimes you answer with analysis. Sometimes you answer by being very annoying and just being silent, so that everybody thinks you're very wise and spends 2,500 years debating why you were silent. I bet the Buddha was feeling really happy in those moments. He probably was sitting here being silent. So many books are going to be written about the silence. Anyway, so here he's very careful to not only address Dandapani respectfully, but to directly address this question. And it's such that one does not conflict with anyone in this world. Kind of a hint, right, as to what Dandapani is doing. Dandapani is being a bit aggressive, a bit not rude exactly, but a bit forward. And the Buddha is trying to defuse the situation. Now, he goes on with this conventional phrase, in this world with its gods, maras, and divinities, this population with its ascetics and Brahmins, its gods and humans. Just briefly to comment on the different entities mentioned here. So this is a very conventional phrase. It's like used very widely. The gods are the devas, who are the kind of the minor divinities in the Indian cosmological scheme, who are born as a result of good karma, and they live happy lives, but those lives are impermanent. Maras, we also already discussed Mara yesterday, so this one's treating like multiple Maras. I guess we can all have our own personal Mara, if we like. And divinities is the Brahma god. So these are like the high deities who are reborn in those realms because of their practice of absorption meditation. And in this population with its ascetics and Brahmins. So these are the samana, the ascetics, and the Brahmins. So the samanas are those such as the Buddha, who were practicing in what we today would be called independent religious movements or new religious movements. And they sort of sprung up in opposition to the Vedic and Brahmanical orthodoxy, and they taught a wide variety of different teachings. But typically, the ascetics would engage in spiritual and ascetic practices like meditation, fasting, rituals, and so on, as well as in philosophical debate and the like. And the Brahmins were those who inherited the ancient tradition of the Vedas and would undertake the duties of reciting Vedic hymns, and in addition, would be memorizing, debating philosophy and meditation and so on as well. It's gods and humans. So again, this is like a conventional phrase meaning basically everyone in the world. So my doctrine is such that one does not conflict with anyone in this world, and it is such that perceptions do not underlie the Brahman who lives detached from sensual pleasures. So just a couple of brief comments on this one. So first of all, perceptions are, very briefly, perceptions are a mode of knowing or a kind of knowing that sees simple wholes. Right? Perception filters, interprets, recognizes experience in terms of simple wholes. I'll come back to that in just a second. Perceptions do not underlie. That means that these remain as potentials, even if they're not particularly manifest. The Brahman, now in this case, the word the Brahman is not the same as previously. So it says ascetics and Brahmins. So there it means people from the Brahmanical caste. It's an inherited tradition, an inherited position. Whereas here, Buddha is using the Brahman in a spiritual sense, meaning an awakened person or an enlightened person. So the perceptions do not underlie the enlightened person who lives detached from sensual pleasures, without doubting, stripped of worry, and rid of craving for rebirth in this or that state. That is my doctrine, and that is what I assert. So just to come back briefly to the idea of perception, this is one of the major themes of this discourse, and we're going to be coming back to it again and again. But let me give just a basic explanation of what I mean by perception recognizing simple wholes. When we see things, right, if we're sitting here in this lovely Tibetan temple, it's incredible, and you are getting a lot of data, right? I mean, so many colors, so many shapes, and everywhere you look, there's something new and something different, and there is so much information there. And our senses are constantly giving us ridiculous amounts of information, like just so much all the time. And if we were to try to live with that raw information, it would just be impossible. So we need to simplify that somehow. So we simplify that information into meaningful wholes. So as I'm sitting here right now, I can look over there. My eyes see red. And that's it. But my mind recognizes door. Oh, that's a red painted door. That's perception. Right? So I've now simplified that data, visual data, into an idea of door. And that allows me to do various things. For example, I can see that door, and if somebody opens and shuts it, I hear a sound, and my perception can say, oh, that sound and that door belong to the same thing. So we're now starting to process our experience in a way that makes sense to us so we can live in a world that is meaningful. But more importantly, we've now processed that information in a way that's actually useful. Because if I want to go out the door, I can go out it because I know that's what doors are for. And so that is then connected with memory, right? My experience of memory teaches me that doors are go-in-y and out-y things. So I don't have to reprocess all of the data that I'm getting every moment. Perception does that for me, simplifies things, and presents me with a world that makes sense. Normally, when we exist in the world, we operate at that level of perception of a world that just kind of makes sense in that way. You see another person, you recognize, oh, that's a person. You see traffic lights, you recognize, oh, that's traffic lights. And you're not having to learn everything from scratch every time. So perception is an essential and really crucial element of how our minds work. Now here, the Buddha says perceptions do not underlie the Brahman, right? So he's pointing to something interesting. He's not saying that the Brahman doesn't have any perceptions. It's that they do not underlie. Exactly does that mean? Why wouldn't you want perceptions to underlie? Like, what's wrong with perceptions? Why would somebody want to be free of them? The Buddha doesn't explain any of those things. So the statement that he gives is, well, somewhat cryptic. I think everyone can agree with that. Yes, a bit cryptic. It's an interesting response, right? On the one hand, his motivations seem clear enough. He wants to diffuse any potential conflict with Dandapani. At the same time, he's also offering this kind of cryptic implication. I feel that he probably wants to give Dandapani a hint about something, but feels like he can't be too blunt about it, and Dandapani might, I don't know, give him a whack with his stick or something. But Dandapani obviously was not ready for that and didn't react well and went on. Now, what was Dandapani's thing? Well, in the suttas, we don't know any more about that, but in the commentaries, it gives us what may be a hint. Commentaries, we have two different commentaries, one in Pali, another one somewhere else, I can't remember where, that tell us the Dandapani's relationship with the Buddha, okay? Unfortunately, they're both different. In one of them, he was the brother of Mahapajapati and Mahamaya. So the Buddha's mother was Mahamaya, and she died 7 days after he was born. And he was brought up by her sister, Mahapajapati, who was the Buddha's foster mother, and also Buddha's aunt. So she raised the Buddha, and later on, when the Buddha had become enlightened, later on she became a bhikkhuni and became enlightened herself. So one story tells us that Dandapani was the brother of those two. Okay. Another story tells us that Dandapani was the father of Yashodhara, who was the Buddha's wife. Okay. And again, somewhat complicated family history there, because they got married, they were very in love, and then the Buddha, Siddhartha, walked out on them. Right? Yikes. It's not good. If someone comes to me and says, oh, I really want to be a monk, should I just walk out on my wife? I would be like, no. They'd be like, but the Buddha did it. I'm like, okay, you got me there, but I still don't think it's a good idea. It's really important. Any great story has to have that moment of irreconcilable conflict. That's what makes it a story. That's when you have a collision of those two different values. That's why there's a tension there. This is really important. This is when Luke Skywalker took off the viewfinder when he was in the canyon. Remember? And he was shooting for the Death Star. And everyone's like, oh no, you have to use this viewfinder. It's all like technology. Machines are going to help you blow up the Death Star. Right? But he's like, use the Force, Luke. Obi-Wan comes to him, use the Force, Luke. And he's like, oh no, use the Force. And he takes the viewfinder off, right? And so there's this kind of meeting of these irreconcilable viewpoints, right? You either rely on the machines or you rely on your own intuition. And he says, no, I'm going to rely on my intuition. Yeah, he blows up the Death Star. Kills thousands of people. Yeah. I'm not supposed to think about that too much. But anyway, all of the plumbers on the Death Star, all of the electricians are just down there fixing a fuse in the hangar bay. Suddenly they get blown up. Anyway, okay, fine. So that moment in the narrative where you reach a point that can't be resolved, and so the Buddha left home, And Yashoda obviously was distraught. She later also ordained, as did Rahula. They all became arahants. So you can say, like, from a doctrinal point of view and a biographical point of view, you can say, well, look, they eventually they all became enlightened. So it worked out well for all of them. But at the same time, I don't think we should negate the fact that there was that pain and suffering at the time. Nobody knew at that time that they were all going to get enlightened. Even the Buddha didn't know he was going to get enlightened. So anyway, so Dandapani possibly was Yashoda's dad. So then Siddhartha then walked out of home and left her behind. So you can see that this Dandapani probably had a pretty good reason for being a bit annoyed with the Buddha, right? Either he was the brother of Maya, who, well, died, or Mahapajapati, who got left behind and abandoned, or he was the father of Yashoda, who got abandoned, or he was both. I mean, families are complicated. That would mean that the Buddha married his cousin, right? Which is quite possible that happened. So he may well have been both brother to Mahapajapati and Mahamaya and father to Yashoda. Anyway, these are the different accounts in the traditions. But regardless, the traditions, despite their differences, do say that he was related to the Buddha. Obviously, he knew who the Buddha was, and he was related in a way where there was family stress and trauma, which you could easily imagine that he would be blaming the Buddha for, right? And this, to me, this is a really interesting detail, because this is pointing to that unacknowledged and unresolved trauma which still exists within families. Even maybe the primary people in that story, right? Like Yashoda herself and Rahula, maybe they went forth and became enlightened. But what about all of the others? Because they're also affected. And Dandapani is one of the ones who's affected as well. So to me, this is kind of a sign of that kind of the ripples of the trauma that can happen whenever you have that kind of thing happening in a family. And this is something that, you know, it's still very much an issue today. People still ask me, you know, I want to go forth, I want to become a monk, I want to become a nun, but, you know, I don't want to upset my parents, and, you know, they'll be so distraught if I leave and so on. And I said, look, you know, it's really actually very simple. If you love your parents, what you'll do is you'll first of all go and join a rock and roll band, and then you'll tell them you want to ordain as a Buddhist monastic, and they'll be like, oh my God, thank goodness. I don't do literally anything else. Easily resolved, that one. But it is traumatic, and I think that in that trauma that's where the power comes, because that's telling us that this is something that means something. It's worth sacrificing. It's worth giving something up, and that sacrifice is not restricted to one person. It's something that has ripples and has wider effect. So this is what I think is going on behind the scenes with Dandapani. All subtext, right? All subtext. Maybe that's none of that is true, right? But that's what I think is going on here. Any questions or thoughts? Yeah.
About this family drama.
Yes.
But most of the time, the Arya-Parishad, I think the Arya-Parishad Sutras show like a very normal thing to go like the left home.
Right.
But Ashwagosha's Buddha's story is like made much drama, I think.
Much more drama, right? But even in that, even in so Kaushal's comparing the canonical sutta, Arya Pariyesana Sutta, where the Buddha is going forth, is described in fairly simple terms, but still there it says, though my mother and father wept with tears running down their faces. Yeah, still going forth. The Buddha didn't shy away from recognizing that. Yeah, that's his determination. And as you said, in Ashwagosha, who was a later Sanskrit writer, about 1,000 years after the Buddha, quite 1,000 years, regarded as one of the greatest poets ever, and he milked it for all it's worth. Yeah, so he's a poet, right? What can you say? Yeah, it's his whole thing, right? But that's it, right? That's the crux of that moment. and it has to be told. Every time a storyteller tells that story, they have to tell it in a different way. You have to find a new resolution, because all of the resolutions that have come before you are unsatisfying. So you have to find something, and that's where that creativity comes. And if you look in the retellings of the Buddha's life story, it's always a bit different. If you're looking like the Jataka stories, again, it's always a bit different. So, and to me, that's something we shouldn't be trying to resolve it, because that tension is the source of energy and dynamism in the Buddhist tradition. Yeah. About fasting. Did the Buddha say anything about fasting? Not too much, actually. I mean, normally, we just eat in the morning and not after the afternoon. Is there anything new about fasting? I can't recall.
Well, he did before his enlightenment.
Before his enlightenment, right? He did extreme fasting, so he almost died from it.
Do that.
That's right. Yeah, so don't. He such extreme fasting that his skin was flaking off, and he said if you touched him on his belly, you could feel his backbone. So that's a bit much. Okay, so not that extreme fasting, but I don't think it actually mentions it. There's the one thing with what's his name, Ananda's preceptor, who was like meditating for several days and putting out slow rice. Remember, he was like drying the rice and keeping the rice lumps.
He wasn't actually fasting.
He wasn't exactly fasting, no. He was like avoiding Indivata. Yeah. So it doesn't really seem to be mentioned very much, but the general idea is that we should eat 1 meal a day or 2 meals a day, and that's good enough. Yeah. When I was in Manachat, my teacher there, Ajahn Pasano, told a story from the Christian Desert Fathers, and he said that there was one time when this young monk went to the abbot and said, "I want to do a special practice of eating a small loaf of bread every second day." And the abbot says, "Okay." He said, "Well, I'd be happier if you had half a loaf of bread every day." Okay. Yeah.
When the Buddha was giving the teaching, sort of orally, obviously, was there any nuance or gestures, or was it kind of sterile?
What do you mean? Were there any nuances and gestures? You mean was he Italian? Well, in one of the things it says that when people would ask him things, he would consent in silence. So I think that means that he would be like, I don't know. I mean, I guess he was gesturing, but he probably wasn't like really wild about it. There's a few places in the suttas that does talk about him like making some gesture or picking something up. Like he gave a lesson about a cup one time, and he picked it up and then turned it upside down, let the water drip out and things like that. So yeah. How are we going? All right. So I'm just wondering whether to continue, or maybe that's enough for tonight. What do you reckon? We've been going about an hour, a bit over an hour. It's probably enough. What do you think? Yeah, that's good. All right. So thanks everybody for coming along. Thank you. I want to genuinely thank you, really from the bottom of my heart, for sharing Dhamma time with me. And I love Dhamma. You might have guessed. And other suttas, and it's one of my favorite suttas. And the reason I've been teaching this the last little while, because I've been reading and studying this sutta for 30 years now. And then just recently, when I was doing some annotations and so on, then I sort of came to a kind of a new understanding or a deeper understanding of it. And really, to me, it's always one of the most profound suttas, but it's one of those things that has grown in my life and with me in my life. And I find that's so to sort of somehow share that excitement of that and that love of that text with you. And also just to, I've found that this particular sutta touches on a number of themes and ideas that are really relevant for meditation, and especially for metta meditation. And as we've seen, Dandapani seems to be a person who has problems with anger. So we're going to be looking in the next class about how that works and understanding the nature of that anger, and hopefully something we can do about it. Yeah.
My question, out of all the suttas,
Yeah.
this also described, that's 24.
Right.
Is there much more? I wonder what is your belief? What really touches you or intrigued you to talk about this called trauma?
Mhm.
Mostly living the confusion, not trying to just quickly solve
Right.
the tension. Compared to many people speaking of one is higher, lower part, the lower level is a term.
Right. Yeah.
So they go going directly to these. Way of seeing this tension.
Mm.
So out of all other things, why we explain why we from family to mom, why we
Men. Thank you for that awesome question. That's great. Well, you're an artist. So the soul of creativity, yeah, you have to have tension. And if you're going to create a work of art, there has to be some conflict there, and there has to be some movement there. And one of the realities of religious life is that religious life tends towards stasis. Means death. So one of the best known, or not best known, but one of my favorite Christian writers is John Bishop Shelby Spong. And my mother introduced me to him. He's a really great writer. And one of the things he said is that religion will die of boredom long before it dies of controversy. And for me, one of the most boring things about religion is when people think that they have all the answers. And it's easy for me to sit here and give you a very simple doctrinal answer to this. And yes, if you want me to say the practice of the Eightfold Path is a higher virtue and it was worth the sacrifice, okay. But to me, that's boring because I've heard it 1,000 times before. And what happens when everybody is saying the same thing is you end up with something which is rigid and stultifying and uncreative, and which doesn't speak to what people actually are doing. It speaks to what people project themselves as doing and to creating some kind of orthodoxy. When I was in Jakarta earlier in the year, I gave this talk. Afterwards, I was talking with this woman came after the talk and stuff. We were talking. There's obviously someone who's very intelligent, obviously someone who loves the Dhamma, was really interested and so on. And, just casually talking and saying, oh, is there a temple or something that you go to? And she said, oh, no, not really. She looked a bit kind of embarrassed or something like that. I'm like, oh, why not? She said, it's just all so boring. Everything's just so boring all the time. And I'm like, yeah, I know what you mean. So for me, it's really important that we find the life in things. And just repeating things and repeating doctrines and repeating dogmas to me is very boring. And like you said, there's 1,000 teachers who are doing that. Good on them. But that's not me. So I want to try to bring it alive, because to me, the life of people in this room is not the life of, yes, I have these questions answered and they're nice and they're neat and everything. But the life is a life of tension, where you're feeling like, should I be here? Should I be calling my family? Should I be doing this? What are my duties? What's the right thing to do? And that to me is part of the creativity of the spiritual life, because it's calling us to question our values and question our choices. So thank you so much for asking that question.
It's creativity is born in the spiritual life, and for the first time it's on the level of creativity. I think it's right.
Look around you. Yeah. Yeah, of course. Creativity is part of who we are. So, you know, how we express our creativity depends on the person. Like if you look at the Buddha was an incredibly creative teacher. How many similes do you find in the suttas? How many different explanations of things? How many different ways of looking at it? I mean, just even that one sutta, right? And the Buddha's asked, what is your doctrine? And he's got a whole list of things he could have answered. It's dependent origination, it's causality, it's anicca dukkha anatta, it's Four Noble Truths. But he answers with something quite unique because it's in that person, for that person. So that's the Buddha's creativity in teaching. And the way that we express that creativity depends. Yeah. And so for me, I do it through teaching, also through my writing and so on. And other people are going to express their creativity in different ways, maybe through building a beautiful temple like this. Yes.
Have you any recommendations like in relation to this sort of data? Means or methods to contemplate that are being created?
So means or methods to what, sorry?
To contemplate, reflect on it.
On the sutta?
Yeah.
Ah. Oh, well, I mean, if you want to, you could take up just the idea of perception we've talked about already. Right? And so you could just pay attention, you know, for the next 24 hours to how your perception is shaping the world around you. Yeah. So just little things like you're sitting there in meditation, somebody closes the door and you think, oh, someone's closed the door. And you go, oh, that's just perception. What I heard was a sound. I didn't hear a door. I didn't hear someone. And just to recognize that difference. Yeah.
So this is mind and sun.
Yes.
To negotiate with spiritual life.
Yes.
If you bring it to this modern world.
Yes.
And you want to communicate with God, family, son, kids, whatsoever. How would you describe finding the spiritual life with this?
How would you describe finding the spiritual life to your kids?
Yes. How could you describe? How could you describe it to them so that they also could understand what it means and maybe peace?
I don't know. I don't know your kids.
I'm sorry?
I don't know your kids, so I don't know.
What is spiritual life?
It honestly,
Honestly,
it really depends, and depends on who they are, and especially how old they are. When I gave a talk at the youth group in Sri Lanka, so the Sri Lankan temple at the youth group a few years ago. So these are mostly like older kids. So these are like 18 to 25 or something like that. And when I was teaching them, then I basically said that the Buddha was a teen rebel who ran away from home and ignored what his parents told him to do. And they were like, oh, yeah, that sounds really good. But the parents weren't in the room. I made sure the parents weren't in the room before I said that. So it really just depends on the perspective and who you're talking to. Okay. And then afterwards they were like, oh, we have never heard anything like that before. Okay. Let's finish up by paying respects to the Triple J.
Bhagavato Sangha Sangha